Within 20 years of Muhammad's death in 632, the new Islamic community controlled vast territories stretching from Egypt through Syria and into Persia. Expansion accelerated under the first caliphs in the mid-600s and 30s, striking at empires long considered invincible. Byzantine cities such as Damascus fell quickly, and within a decade, the Persian Empire itself collapsed. However, conversion to Islam was not mandatory. Many subjects retained their faith, raising the question, how was such control maintained? The answer lies in the 5 pillars, daily duties that fostered unity and a sense of belonging. To understand their influence, we must first look back to Arabia itself. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. In the centuries before a new faith transformed it, Arabia was a region defined more by kinship than by kingdoms. Life depended primarily on tribes. Protection, identity, and survival were rooted in family ties. However, these ties also bred rivalry, as honor was defended with force. An insult could spark years of blood feuds. Far from being still and silent, the desert realm was vibrant with uneasy alliances, sudden raids, and ongoing conflicts over wells, grazing routes, and caravans. The desert itself was not uniform. Much of the central peninsula was arid and inhospitable, favoring nomadic herding and continual movement. Yet in the far south, in Yemen, once known as Arabia Felix, fertile lands allowed agriculture to thrive. This contrast shaped the culture. Some groups roamed in a persistent search for pasture, while others governed small kingdoms. For most Arabs, however, the dominant reality was scarcity, which tightly bound them to the group they trusted most, their tribe. Honor codes were embedded in this environment. Betrayal risked exile, which for a nomad meant vulnerability to raids and even enslavement. Kinship defined safety. With no strong central authority, there was no permanent law beyond what tribe leaders and poets could uphold. Poets celebrated victory, mocked rivals, and preserved the collective memory. Ancestry was recited with care because lineage demonstrated authority and legitimacy. Essentially, reputation acted as the archive of power. At the same time, Arabia did not remain completely isolated from the rest of the world. Caravans transported incense, spices, and textiles north to Syria and Mesopotamia, as well as westward towards Egypt and the Red Sea. Towns such as Mecca and Medina became prosperous through trade, serving as centers for merchants and pilgrims that connected the peninsula with distant empires. Mecca housed the Kaaba, an ancient sanctuary visited by tribes who worshipped their various gods, represented by idols within the shrine. Rather than fostering unity, this arrangement reinforced division. Each group viewed its deities as symbols of its own identity. For a merchant, this environment created opportunities. Trade could generate wealth, but success always involved risks. Rival clans might raid caravans, seize goods, or disrupt journeys before they reached their markets. Pilgrimage and raiding were often intertwined. Shrines brought wealth to cities, yet constant blood conflicts threatened travelers. Agreements between groups were fragile, usually made and broken within short periods. No authority existed to maintain peace across the entire region. For centuries, Arabia remained divided, held together by small bonds of convenience rather than by a unified rule. However, Arabia's strategic location mattered. To the north and east lay the Byzantine and Persian empires, powerful ancient states weakened by long wars, but still influential in culture and influence. They did not govern Arabia, but it existed in their shadow. Traders moved between these empires, carrying with them stories, religions, and laws. Jews and Christians lived within Arabian towns alongside polytheists. Their presence provided an alternative to tribal cults and offered an early insight into monotheism. Arabia was not an isolated desert. It acted as a buffer, being both independent and receptive to influences that pointed towards alternative ways of life. This mixture created contrasts, a world of commercial towns, yet also one of nomadic camps. Wealth was amassed in Mecca, but insecurity plagued the trade routes. Pilgrims crowded around shrines, yet no religion united all Arabs. Merchants might glimpse more centralized states beyond the borders, but at home, kinship remained the only real bond. It was a society that functioned, but under constant strain. Over time, the faults widened. Feuding wasted resources that could have enriched communities. Travel became so dangerous that it unsettled merchants. Even pilgrimage risked disruption from violence. City leaders depended on the success of trade and shrines, but peace proved impossible to sustain solely through tribal customs. The demand for something more substantial grew, not an empire imposed from outside, but an idea emerging from within that could bring order to the chaos of rivalry. An analogy makes this clearer. Imagine a chessboard where each piece acts independently, with no overarching strategy guiding them. Each clan defended its modest square, but without coordination, the game remained unchanged. What could unify these countless small pieces? It would take more than wealth or force. It would need a principle transparent enough for a shepherd to follow, valuable enough for a merchant to respect, and trustworthy enough to replace the role once filled solely by bloodline. That principle started to take shape through one man, a merchant who organized caravans in Mecca and earned a reputation for honesty. A man who understood the constant rivalries, traveled the routes strained by conflict, and had encountered the diverse beliefs flowing through the city. When he claimed to speak with revelation, he was not simply adding another god to the polytheistic landscape. He was challenging the foundation of Arabian politics and life. His message replaced tribe with community, rivalry with shared worship, and lineage with a single god whose authority transcended kinship. For centuries, desert tribes appeared to be immune to lasting authority. Yet the basis of loyalty was shifting now. Blood feuds and narrow identities were losing their hold in the face of a teaching that promised unity beyond kin. What was emerging was not just a religion, but a new way of organizing power and belonging. The next step in the story poses a crucial question. How could one merchant, known for his trade in Mecca, become the figure at the center of an enduring community and eventually an empire? To answer, we look to his life and what set him apart. In Mecca, reputation often mattered more than wealth, and Muhammad's early life reflects this. Known as the trustworthy, he built respect through his honesty in the caravan trade. In a society where trust rarely extended beyond family, he stood out. This reputation was further reinforced when he married Khadija, a prosperous merchant whose standing provided him with financial stability and social influence. For a man without elite tribal lineage, credibility and character became his greatest assets. Through trade and travel, he gained broader connections, learning of customs and beliefs beyond Arabia's traditional polytheism. Those encounters included ideas of strict monotheism. Traders from the north spoke of Jewish and Christian teachings, both of which are rooted in the claim that one God rules all. These faiths contrasted sharply with Mecca's Kaaba, filled with idols representing tribal deities. Mecca thrived on the pilgrims who visited this sanctuary, a system that enriched the city's leading clans. For the guardians of this shrine, idol worship was closely linked to both profit and prestige. When Muhammad began reporting revelations around the age of 40, he proclaimed a radical message. There was only one God, and no idol had power. To believers, this was spiritual clarity, but to Mecca's leaders, it was an economic disruption. Diminish the Kaaba's idols, and the basis of pilgrimage revenue weakens. To them, his words were more than blasphemy. They struck at the wealth of those whose influence depended on the old system. This explains why early converts faced hostility. Yet the message took root, especially among those who held little power in tribal society. For the poor, the enslaved, and those excluded by the dominance of clan hierarchies, Muhammad's call to equality before God offered dignity and a sense of belonging. Worth was no longer determined by tribe or social status, but by one's beliefs. Over time, some respected individuals also joined, demonstrating that the appeal of his teachings extended beyond the margins. But as the group gradually grew, so too did the opposition. Ridicule turned into harassment, and harassment into violence. The movement was becoming impossible to ignore. The turning point came with the Hijra, the migration to Medina in 622. Later, Islamic tradition views this mainly as an escape from imminent danger in Mecca, often described as fleeing from assassination attempts. Modern interpretations, however, suggest another layer, that factions in Medina invited Muhammad to serve as an arbitrator in the city's disputes. Leaving Mecca may have been a strategic, calculated decision as much as a forced one. Whatever the reason, it was a decisive move. The Hijra marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar because, in Medina, the message of revelation shifted from a private faith to the foundation of a community. This shift transformed Arabia's political landscape. In Medina, Muhammad was no longer a preacher on the periphery. His sermons evolved into governance, mediating disputes, establishing rules, and uniting diverse people into the Umma, the community of faith. For the first time, loyalty extended beyond kinship to shared belief. Tribal divisions, while not eradicated, were anchored in a broader sense of belonging. Agreements he made with Muslim followers, Jews, and local clans reflected a new principle: that religion could unite people with no shared bloodline. In a region fractured by tribes, this was an experiment in order. This dual authority, religious and civic, carried both risks and power. Clashes soon ensued. Quraysh and their allies confronted Medina with force, aiming to thwart Muhammad's movement before it expanded further. During the battles that followed, Muhammad acted as both prophet and leader, guiding strategy and bolstering morale through the conviction that divine support was with them. Victories, even small ones, strengthened his standing among followers. Each survival made it harder for other tribes to dismiss him. To observers across Arabia, it became increasingly evident that a new force was rising and that allegiance to the Ummah might offer more stability than ceaseless feuds. The character of his leadership was evident both in everyday life and in war. Rituals of prayer, fasting, and charity linked faith with order. Simultaneously, rules for resolving disputes, dividing spoils, and conduct in conflict established a legal framework. Through him, devotion and governance became interconnected. It can be imagined as weaving two colors into the same fabric. Remove one thread, and the entire pattern unravels. Years later, when Muhammad returned to Mecca, he did so as both prophet and statesman. In 630, Mecca surrendered, and the idols of the Kaaba were removed. This was a pivotal moment. The triumph of one god marked not only a religious victory, but also the end of the city's old elite structure. The shrine, once shared among many gods and tribes, became the central symbol of a new unity. Power was no longer solely based on clan heritage, but rooted in participation in the system of belief and practice Muhammad had established. From then on, the message could no longer be contained within small circles or tribal borders. What began with a trader's reputation for honesty evolved into a guided revelation, challenging old hierarchies, forging new community bonds, and establishing a model of leadership that blended heaven's authority with practical governance. The framework Muhammad left behind demonstrated how belief could organize society and how daily acts of devotion could transform into shared strength. This is why the rhythm of life was so important. For believers, rituals of prayer, almsgiving, fasting, and pilgrimage were not only personal duties, but collective customs that united people. By repeating these simple practices, followers learned the patterns of a new identity. Across deserts and towns, ordinary acts were becoming the anchors of unity. The question remains, what specific practices could bear such weight, strong enough to unite strangers into one community and sustain it across generations? What gave early Islam its remarkable cohesion was the 5 anchors of faith, more commonly known as the 5 pillars. These were not abstract beliefs reserved for scholars, but tangible obligations that anyone could perform. They asked little more than consistency and sincerity. A shepherd in the hills, a merchant on the road, or a soldier away from home could all carry them out equally. Their essence was clarity. Where tribal life had bound you through ancestry, the pillars bound you through devotion. The first was the confession of faith, the Shahada. It is a short, direct statement that there is only one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. To make this declaration was to enter the shared identity of Islam. The simplicity masked its radical nature. In a society where clans traced their honor to specific idols or local spirits, the Shahada undercut centuries of custom in one sentence. It stripped away the hierarchy of which shrine you belonged to, or which lineage you could boast of. Uttering it sincerely placed you inside the same spiritual family as any other believer, whether Bedouin, city dweller, or outsider newly converted. The second was Salat, the 5 daily prayers. These prayers turned belonging into a visible rhythm. At dawn, midday, afternoon, sunset, and night, Muslims stopped what they were doing, faced Mecca, and bowed in unison. Imagine the scene: a farmer pausing in his field, a caravan halting in the dust, a villager kneeling in the courtyard. Suddenly, time itself was reshaped. It was no longer measured only by work hours or seasonal grazing. It now followed an everyday religious schedule. Even across great distances, the knowledge that others were bowing in the same direction at the same time created an invisible thread of unity. Third came Zakat, the prescribed almsgiving. In Arabia, wealth had often been redistributed through sporadic acts of generosity or by the obligations of kin. Zakat standardized charity by making it a duty for anyone with means, usually a set portion of one's surplus wealth. This practice redefined wealth as something carrying responsibility beyond one's relatives. a wealthy merchant in Damascus and a landowner in Medina alike contributed to maintaining the poor, aiding travelers, and relieving hardship. Through zakat, the idea of community widened. It was not just your clan that mattered, but the well-being of the Umma as a whole. The fourth pillar was Sawm, the fast of Ramadan. During this month, eating and drinking were forbidden from sunrise until sunset. Families and communities broke the fast together after dusk, turning the evenings into moments of gathering. On the surface, it was an exercise in discipline, but it carried more profound lessons. The hunger and thirst during daylight hours fostered sympathy for those who had little by necessity, not choice. It leveled social differences by subjecting rich and poor to the same physical test. And because the fast applied to all Muslims everywhere at once, it created an annual cycle that brought scattered groups into one rhythm. The final pillar was Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Required only once in a lifetime for those who could afford it, it served as the most powerful display of unity. People from distant regions converged on one sanctuary. Instead of tribal shrines with competing idols, the Kaaba now stood as the center of devotion. Pilgrims performed the same rites side by side, regardless of their origin or status. A farmer from Yemen could circumambulate the shrine alongside a merchant from Syria. In that shared movement and chant, differences diminished in significance. Together, these 5 practices offered something rare: obligations anyone could perform without priests, elaborate temples, or complex rites. Early Islam had no formal clergy to control access to God. Authority resided not in intermediaries, but in the believer's willingness to carry out simple acts of devotion. This made the religion highly portable. Unlike the liturgies of Judaism or Christianity, which often required specialists or sacred buildings, Islam needed only time, direction, and intent. The pillars could be practiced by a traveler resting beside a well as easily as by a villager in a mosque. That portability suited a society in motion. Armies, caravans, and herders were constantly on the move. Yet discipline and unity did not depend on fixed institutions. A Muslim soldier could pray in formation at dawn. A trader, forgetting his hunger at midday, knew that across the desert, others fasted too. Coherence traveled with them. It was not fragile, for it did not rely on permanent centers. The practices themselves created the center, wherever the believers happened to be. The pillars also fostered equality. Leaders and common followers assumed the same postures, spoke the exact words, and observed the identical fasts. Wealth did not exempt one from charity, but instead heightened obligation. Social rank could not shield someone from hunger during Ramadan. Family lineage mattered much less than participation in the same rites. In practice, this meant converts from outside Arabia never had to remain outsiders. Uttering the Shahada and joining the rhythm of prayer instantly brought them inside. They also provided psychological security. Life in early Islamic society was tumultuous. Cities were conquered, dynasties rose and fell, and trade routes shifted. Amidst this chaos, the pillars offered an unshakable order. Prayer is divided into familiar segments each day. Fasting shaped the year with a notable season. Almsgiving united communities through obligation and reassurance. Pilgrimage served as a reminder of a wider human fellowship. Routine became a defense against uncertainty. If you imagine the community of believers as an arch spanning great distances, the pillars were the stones that held it in place. Without them, the arch might sag and collapse. With them, it could support expansion and change. The strength of this foundation came not from its complexity, but from its dedication to excellence. Small acts, when repeated daily, yearly, or over a lifetime, create remarkable stability. This stability endured in ways that politics often did not. Leaders could die or fall, but acts of prayer and fasting persisted unaltered. A new city might be established hundreds of kilometers from the old centers, yet its people could face Mecca just as devoutly. This made the Umma independent of individual rulers. Its true unity was not in allegiance to men, but in obedience to God, carried out through everyday routines. Across newly settled or conquered lands, the sight of bowing toward Mecca served as a visual reminder of shared direction and loyalty. Villagers in North Africa, farmers in Iraq, and soldiers in Arabia all faced the same point. The pillars reached further and held stronger than the bonds of blood alone. From confession to pilgrimage, each pillar played a role in fostering a common understanding among strangers. What they created was not merely a shared religion, but a new foundation for unity. They prepared believers to see themselves as part of a single body, which could then support political structures. In this way, the pillars were more than rituals. They reshaped loyalty, subtly shifting it from a tribal identity to a broader one that encompassed thousands of tribes. The acts of worship laid the groundwork for something greater, a community seen as both spiritual and social, tightly bound together through everyday practices. It was on this new foundation that the next phase emerged, the rise of the Ummah, where the strongest bonds people recognized began to move away from bloodlines and towards faith. In Medina, a very different kind of community started to take shape. What emerged was the Ummah, the first organized group of Muslims who saw themselves connected not by ancestry, but by faith. This was more than just an alliance for survival. It was the creation of a new identity. For people long used to answering the question of, "Who are you?" with a father's name or tribal lineage, the idea that belief itself could define belonging was unprecedented. This change did not instantly overturn centuries of custom. Arabia had long been organized around kinship, with clans serving as the protectors of safety, honor, and justice. No official authority existed to settle disputes permanently. Tribal oaths and fragile truces kept the system barely functioning enough to endure. Yet in Medina, a new pattern emerged. Religion evolved into a framework broad enough to cross family boundaries, promising stability not through inheritance, but through commitment. Where cycles of vengeance had once drained communities, the Ummah provided a shared framework for settling disputes under common principles. In practice, this even transformed relations with Jewish groups in Medina. Some were bound under new rules, while others were eventually expelled under the same communal framework. The implications were profound. For centuries, a man abandoned by his clan was effectively lost. Without kin defense, he was vulnerable to attack, enslavement, or exile. In Medina, that protection could now be replaced by membership in the Ummah. The community bore the duties of mutual defense and arbitration, which reduced the need for constant counter-raids. For the first time, identity could be attached to a society larger than kinship networks, with its protection extended through adherence to divine law. At its core, the Ummah fused devotion with political order. Participation in prayer, fasting, and almsgiving was never merely an inner expression of belief. Each act was also a declaration of allegiance to the broader community. Muhammad became both a messenger and an arbiter, delivering revelation, resolving disputes, and establishing standards of conduct. In effect, the Umma functioned as a social contract founded on the recognition of God's law as the authority higher than clan tradition. This blurred the line between personal worship and civic belonging. Attending the Friday prayer in Medina, or setting aside wealth for charity, was public proof that you identified as part of the collective. Every day, devotion doubled as a demonstration of loyalty, and this steadily created a community with cohesion stronger than any tribal pact. A nomadic herder or city merchant could pray in the same direction, follow the same ritual rhythm, and see themselves as part of one body regardless of origin. That cohesion enabled cooperation once considered impossible. Tribes that had spilt blood against each other for generations could, for the first time, act in alliance, united by what they now held in common. Kinship remained important, but its role was secondary. Honor rested less on clan retaliation and more on obedience to God's commands. Rivalry still erupted, but the incentive structure had shifted. Survival, prosperity, and order now came more readily through unity than through feud. Early results lent credibility to this new structure. When disagreements arose within Medina, they were increasingly resolved through arbitration based on the community's principles rather than retaliation. Practical benefits became evident early on. Fewer raids that consumed resources, increased confidence among traders and farmers, and a sense of fairness rooted in principles beyond clan pride. The system was not perfect, and tensions persisted, but the fact that disputes could be directed toward law and principle rather than vengeance marked a significant shift in approach. Religion had fostered a form of civic peace that was previously unimaginable. The new community also transformed how outsiders viewed Medina. Approaching the city no longer meant negotiating with a single clan or rival faction. Instead, one faced a collective identity with cohesion stronger than kinship ever offered. That strength became an attraction. Neighboring groups, once suspicious, observed the stability the Muslims established and began to consider alliances. The Ummah's reputation gradually extended beyond Medina's walls into the wider Arabian world. One way to picture this shift is to imagine a desert scattered with separate tents, each guarded and distrustful of the rest. The Ummah pulled those tents into a circle around a shared hearth. Each tribe remained distinct, but the shared fire provided a sense of coherence, warmth, and a common focus. That center was faith itself, and around it, a new political community formed. Importantly, the Ummah did not erase differences, but reoriented them. Tribes and clans retained their cultural identities, but their conflicts were channeled through law and devotion rather than prolonged revenge. Pride in kin remained possible, yet it existed under a larger umbrella where faith defined primary loyalty. This dual identity, tribal attachment, combined with religious allegiance, allowed a patchwork society to expand while avoiding rapid collapse into competing feuds. The endurance of this structure lay in its portability. Tribal loyalties were tied to geography and bloodlines. The Ummah was tied to ritual and belief, which could travel across frontiers. That is why Muslim identity quickly reached beyond Arabia. In towns outside the peninsula, converts stepped into the same rhythms of daily prayer and annual fasting, immediately integrated into the same community as those in Medina. Unlike identity restricted by ancestry, this one was open to all who professed its creed. The effects extended into military organization. For the first time, armies could unite around something more cohesive than temporary clan alliances. Soldiers were bound not just by promises of plunder, but by a shared sense of duty. What might have been disjointed skirmishes are now transformed into coordinated campaigns, each part connected by loyalty to a single communal and spiritual mission. Opponents accustomed to fragmented desert tactics now faced armies that remained cohesive under pressure. Believers fought not only for survival, but for the community they embodied daily through their rituals. For ordinary men and women, the Umma offered dignity and reassurance. Even those from marginalized backgrounds gained recognition as full members of a body where equality of devotion mattered more than lineage. At prayer or in fasting, there was no aristocratic exemption. All observed the same duties. The rich gave charity as a matter of obligation. The poor received support without shame. This sense of participation made the Umma appealing across social boundaries and granted it resilience that no single tribe had ever achieved. That resilience was tested as the community interacted with rivals and neighbors. Yet the underlying framework held, loyalty rooted in shared belief. While clan ties often fractured under strain, faith-based cohesion persisted. The Umma became stronger than geography, stronger than ancestry, and resilient enough to lead its people into a future of increasing conflict and expansion. The lesson for both insiders and outsiders was clear. Religion had created not just a system of meaning, but also a political entity capable of stability and action. As this body grew, it faced a crucial dilemma. When expansion brought new populations under its rule, how would they be governed, and what would be expected of them? Why did the First Islamic Empire expand so rapidly without forcing millions to abandon their religions? In an era when many rulers demanded shared gods, official cults, or even recognition of emperors as divine, the armies of Islam followed a different approach. Conquests established swift political control, but conversion was left to happen naturally over time. The key difference lies less in abstract ideals and more in prudent governance, a combination of taxation, accommodation, and pragmatism. When Muslim forces entered new territories, their focus was on maintaining order rather than causing upheaval. Cities and villages were not destroyed. People remained in their homes, worked their fields, traded in markets, and observed familiar customs. The new administrators recognized that stability created more wealth than widespread disruption. An intact farming population paid taxes. Displaced or starving groups paid little or none. Simply put, rulers gained more from steady labor than from chaos. Central to this system was the Dhimma arrangement. Jews and Christians, recognized as people of the book, were permitted to practice their religions, manage their internal communal affairs, and keep their property. This legal status came with responsibilities, including the jizya, a head tax levied on non-Muslims, and the kharaj, a land tax based on property and land area. These payments secured protection under Muslim rule and allowed minority communities judicial independence in their own matters. For rulers, it provided a predictable income. For subjects, it ensured continuity of daily life within a new hierarchy. It is essential to be clear about the nature of this tolerance. The Dhimma was not a modern concept of religious freedom. Non-Muslims held a distinct, legally marked status below Muslims. Yet, compared to forced conversions or outright displacement, it provided a measure of security. A Christian farmer could still tend his land, a Jewish community could still conduct its worship, and both could expect their possessions to be respected in return for regular tax payments. The framework codified differences into law, making them manageable rather than explosive. The rationale behind this was pragmatic. By avoiding mass conversion, the authorities sidestepped conflict and maintained stable revenue flows. In fact, early administrators often hesitated to promote rapid conversions because each new Muslim would be exempt from the jizya, reducing income to the treasury. For a state still reliant on financing soldiers and administration, keeping communities intact and taxable was more practical than pursuing sudden religious homogeny. Tolerance, in this context, made fiscal sense. Evidence of this approach is evident in Egypt. Long after the Arab conquest, the Christian majority remained intact. In 750, over a century later, Egypt still regarded most of its population as Christian. Many churches continued to operate, and local communities retained their distinct identities. Rather than vanishing under new rulers, they became stable contributors to an empire that thrived on their productivity. Daily life reflected a compromise. Muslims enjoyed privileges that others did not, but non-Muslim communities endured without being wiped out. Church bells could still be heard, synagogues continued to open their doors, and local councils managed internal affairs. The administration often kept existing record systems and officials, meaning the experience of governance changed less than one might expect. For many, it appeared more like continuity under a different banner than destruction. This contrasts with earlier empires. Rome had insisted on central cults and often persecuted dissenters. The Persians, too, promoted Zoroastrianism as part of civic identity. Religious differences frequently sparked rebellion. In comparison, the early Islamic approach regularized diversity through taxation. Communities were organized within a tiered system, rather than being obliterated. For subjects, this meant paying fixed dues while avoiding harsher alternatives, such as suppression. None of this implied equality. The Dhimma always emphasized subordination. For non-Muslims, exemptions did not exist, and status differences were apparent. Yet, for many households, paying a predictable tax was preferable to exile or forced worship. For farmers, artisans, and traders, the protection of their livelihoods outweighed the disadvantages of being considered second class. The system was effective. For Muslims, conquest provided access to new lands, resources, and prestige. For those ruled, life continued with only a few added costs, and few were asked to give up their culture or sacred traditions. The system attracted populations from Syria, Egypt, and Iraq with little disruption. What might have caused ongoing revolts instead became a structured agreement. The consequences were significant for expansion. By avoiding forced uniformity, the empire maintained order. Armies could push further without the constant burden of suppressing rebellions in conquered areas. Administrators collected taxes, soldiers received wages, and further campaigns became feasible. Practicality increased the benefits of zeal. You could picture the system like a farmer tending a diverse orchard. One farmer insists that every tree must produce the same fruit and cuts down those that differ. He ends up with less harvest. Another accepts each tree's kind, gathers fruit from all, and steadily enriches himself over time. The second was similar to early Muslim rulers. They respected differences, generated a steady yield, and allowed change to develop gradually. Conversion still occurred, but at a slow pace. Incentives increased over generations. Avoidance of the jizya, access to positions exclusive to Muslims, and inclusion in Islamic rituals. However, this was not due to an official decree. It was a gradual process, decided upon community by community, family by family, motivated as much by the benefits as by conviction. This way, the empire absorbed diversity while maintaining cohesion. What made this model effective was its combination of strength and restraint. Conquest provided territory, governance ensured stability. By allowing tradition to persist under new overlords, officials ensured that the empire did not fracture as it expanded. The durability of these arrangements becomes even more evident when viewed in comparison to the broader world beyond Arabia. While the governance model stabilized the conquered regions, the external environment offered unprecedented opportunities. At the edges of the peninsula stood two great powers, long established and formidable, yet weakened at a critical moment. How could two empires that had dominated the Near East for centuries fall so quickly once the Arab armies appeared? The explanation lies not in some sudden brilliance unique to their new challengers, but in what had already happened to Persia and Byzantium long before the conquests began. Both had spent generations draining themselves in constant rivalry, and disasters from within had left them unable to resist an unexpected surge of external pressure. The Byzantine Empire had long been tempted by dreams of restoring Rome's former glory. Under Justinian in the 6th century, that ambition led to costly campaigns in North Africa, Spain, and Italy. These reconquests appeared glorious on maps, but they stretched the empire's resources thin. By diverting funds and workforce westward, Byzantium reduced its ability to control its eastern frontier, where Persia had always posed a threat. Even when Byzantine forces regained cities along the Mediterranean, the victories came at a hidden cost. The defenses closer to Syria and Mesopotamia were left fragile, and when new enemies emerged, this imbalance revealed the empire's limitations. Persia faced its own burdens. For centuries, the Sasanian dynasty had engaged in fierce struggles with Rome and Byzantium along their shared borders. Each side pushed into the other's territory at different times, only to retreat after costly stalemates. By the early 7th century, another round of war left Persia temporarily victorious. Its forces captured Jerusalem in 614 and threatened Constantinople itself. However, sustaining such extensive campaigns drained the treasury and fatigued the army. When Byzantium, under Emperor Heraclius, launched a remarkable counterattack in the 620s, the Persians were too exhausted to mount a resistance. The peace that followed did not offer either side recovery. Instead, it left both exhausted. The disease amplified the strain. In 542, during the reign of Justinian, the Byzantine Empire was struck by what is remembered as the Justinianic plague. This outbreak potentially killed a third of the population. The shock disrupted agriculture, diminished armies, and lowered revenue. Repeated waves meant recovery was sluggish at best. Persia recorded less about the epidemic, but surviving sources suggest it also suffered. For both empires, war losses combined with shrinking populations meant that, by the early 7th century, they were merely shadows of their former strength. When Arab incursions began a few decades later, the damage was still visible in empty fields, weakened garrisons, and exhausted populations. When Arab raids probed the borders, they revealed how vulnerable those frontiers had become. These initial strikes, known as razzia, were aimed at plunder rather than conquest. However, what they uncovered was startling. Many regions could barely withstand the pressure. Fortresses were understaffed, towns were poorly supplied, and troops were hesitant to fight after years of war. The Arabs quickly realized that what started as raids could escalate into something larger. The lack of a strong defense was an open invitation to carry on. Mobility gave the new armies the advantage they required. Accustomed to arduous journeys across desert terrain, they mastered the utilization of light cavalry. This enabled them to move swiftly, avoid fixed battles, and hit supply lines. Byzantium had long depended on heavy infantry supported by armor-clad cavalry. Persia had refined set-piece formations backed by carefully organized troops. Both strategies presumed predictable campaigns and secure supply routes. Against a flexible force that appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly, they struggled. Fortresses could be bypassed, armies outflanked, and leaders caught unprepared. Geography, once an obstacle, became an ally for desert-trained soldiers. Added to this was the issue of loyalty within the empires themselves. In Byzantine-controlled regions, theology had caused lasting divisions. Imperial church policy enforced orthodoxy, but many Christian sects, such as the Monophysites, felt marginalized and sometimes persecuted. For locals who already harbored resentment against Constantinople, the arrival of Arab rule did not necessarily mean disaster. Some even saw an opportunity to live with less imperial interference in their religious practices. This reduced the population's willingness to resist, leaving imperial troops to fight without the strong local support they needed. The Arabs brought their own motivation. They fought not just for plunder, but also with the belief that their campaigns had a divine purpose. The concept of jihad, understood as a struggle for one's faith, provided them with moral resilience and a sense of focus. For soldiers who had once been part of fragmented clans, this conviction turned raids into missions. When set against opponents weary from endless wars, that zeal mattered. A smaller but coordinated and determined force can often succeed where a larger, unfocused one cannot. The consequences were visible in rapid results. Damascus fell early, opening all of Syria to Arab control. Within a few years, Egypt, the vital breadbasket of the Byzantine world, was also lost. Losing Egypt meant losing grain supplies and tax revenues on which Constantinople heavily relied. For Persia, the blows were even harsher. Years of royal power collapsed in a single generation. Regional governors lost coherence, the monarchy fractured, and the administration dissolved. By the mid-7th century, Persian lands were no longer the seat of an empire, but provinces of a rising caliphate. To grasp the scale of this change, imagine two wrestlers locked in a grueling fight. They strain, fall, and rise again, battling the same opponent year after year. Then, as both approach exhaustion, a new fighter steps into the ring. It's not that the newcomer is stronger than either was at their peak, but that the moment of fatigue leaves them unable to resist a modest push. That is what happened to the great powers of Byzantium and Persia when their new rivals appeared. However, one must be cautious not to tell the story as if the Arabs alone overthrew them through brilliance. Their victories were only possible because the old empires were already in crisis. Overstretched by Justinian's earlier policies, drained by decades of Byzantine-Sasanian conflict, and weakened by population loss from plague. Timing was everything. The collapse was sudden, but its roots stretched back over a century of decisions, mistakes, and misfortunes. Byzantium endured, though in a diminished form. From its remaining stronghold in Anatolia, it persisted for centuries, defending Constantinople and adjusting to reduced circumstances. However, the era when it wielded control over Egypt and Syria was over. Persia fared even worse, ceasing to exist as an independent imperial power altogether. To neighboring societies used to their dominance, this transformation seemed almost unreal. What Roman legions had failed to destroy, and what Persian kings had guarded for generations, collapsed with startling speed. The Arab armies revealed a simple truth: even mighty powers crumble when stretched beyond their limits. Once the gates had been swung open, the question was no longer whether conquest was possible, but how these lightly armed desert forces could achieve so much against foes who had ruled with soldiers, walls, and cavalry for centuries. What made the desert armies effective was not only the collapse of their opponents, but also the way they fought. Their strategies were directly influenced by the environment that shaped them. Life in Arabia required resilience, moving lightly, enduring hunger and heat, and covering vast distances without faltering. When these traits were applied in war, they became tactics that larger empires, burdened by supply chains and heavy formations, found difficult to counter. Initially, many campaigns were not aimed at conquest. They resembled razzia, raids for plunder that had been customary in Arabia long before Islam. Small groups attacked settlements or caravan routes, seizing goods before moving on to their next target. However, as these raids faced less resistance than expected, a change occurred. What began as plundering expeditions gradually expanded into permanent occupations. The transition from raid to conquest was slow but clear. Weakened frontiers, exhausted by decades of imperial conflict, provided openings through which raids steadily evolved into empire. Mobility was the critical advantage. Arab forces relied on light cavalry, trained through years of desert travel. Their horses could cover long distances swiftly, often without the lengthy supply trains that Byzantine or Persian soldiers required. In contrast, imperial armies deployed heavily armored troops. These formations bore both iron and logistical burdens. They moved with authority, but lacked agility. Conversely, the Arabs could appear, strike, and disappear. To their opponents, it felt like chasing shadows. This agility influenced how battles unfolded. Instead of rigid ranks aiming for open field clashes, Arab commanders maintained loose and fluid formations. They circled, harassed, pressed a flank, and cut off supplies. Byzantine forces were accustomed to heavy cavalry charges supported by infantry blocks. The Persians relied on elite formations and war elephants to intimidate their enemies. But their fluid cavalry made these displays less effective, slipping through gaps and avoiding confrontation until conditions favored them. You might imagine it like a chessboard. Against towers and heavy queens, robust but predictable, the Arabs moved like knights, quick and angled, always dictating the pace instead of following it. The desert itself became a weapon. For Byzantine and Persian commanders, arid landscapes were obstacles. Supply lines stretched long and became vulnerable. Soldiers, unaccustomed to the climate, suffered. For Arabs, these same conditions were familiar territory. They knew where wells were, how far a horse could go without water, and how to ration grain in ways outsiders would not attempt. What others viewed as inhospitable terrain, they regarded as home ground. Campaigns that appeared punishing to outsiders felt natural to them, and long marches fatigued opponents while leaving Arab forces relatively unscathed. Endurance alone, however, would not have been sufficient. Motivation was crucial. Fighters believed they were engaged in jihad, a struggle in the path of God. This conviction gave them confidence, framing hardship as a meaningful sacrifice. To enemies, warriors unafraid of death seemed unsettling, as if they fought with unbreakable energy. But zeal was not the only motivator. The conquest policy balanced religious language with pragmatic aims. Leaders encouraged expansion for resources and stability, just as much as for faith. In practice, spoils kept armies committed, while belief united them into disciplined ranks. That dual incentive was potent. Raiding had long been a traditional practice in Arabia, one that often pitted tribes against each other. Under Islamic leadership, those impulses were redirected outward. Instead of fueling blood feuds among kin, warfare now generated gains from neighboring lands. Success against external rivals prevented the internal collapse that endless vendettas once threatened. Faith justified reward-motivated participation redirected old rivalries, fostering cohesion. Tactically, these armies valued flexibility over brute force. Rather than launching direct attacks against fortifications, they struck from the flanks, targeting supply routes or vulnerable detachments. Armies expecting orderly set-piece battles found themselves confronting elusive opponents. Imperial commanders often found their plans reduced to a frustrating game of reaction, responding to moves that had already been executed. Even seemingly impregnable strongholds could be bypassed, isolated, and forced to surrender through starvation or isolation, rather than through a frontal assault. Timing favored these tactics. Byzantium and Persia were already weakened. Their militaries, once vast, could not easily be replenished. When Arab troops bypassed fortresses or disrupted supplies, garrisons fell faster than they might have decades earlier. A hungry army is vulnerable, and few empires understood this lesson more painfully than Persia in its final days. The impact on local populations was significant. Many believed their imperial rulers unshakable, yet within a few years, frontier regions collapsed under pressure from foes described as lightly armed tribesmen. This gap between expectation and reality eroded public confidence in the old regimes. The Arabs' success seemed to gather its own momentum, convincing soldiers and civilians alike that divine support explained the unlikely victories. Each conquest became proof of destiny for some, a source of shock and demoralization for others. Practicality also influenced their advancement. Because Arab armies operated without extensive supply convoys, they did not devastate the conquered countryside on the scale of older imperial campaigns. Fields and towns were often left intact, providing immediate income streams. This was deliberate. Resources needed for governance were allocated and preserved, rather than being wasted. Where empires like Byzantium might strip regions bare, moving armies through, the Arabs kept conquered provinces productive and thriving. Strategy extended beyond winning battles. It ensured an economic foundation for expansion. The results of these approaches evoke an image. Heavy empires collided like great hammers, destroying but exhausting themselves at the same time. The desert armies resembled a river. They flowed around obstacles, cut channels where rock was weakest, and in doing so, reshaped landscapes without shattering them. Mobility, endurance, faith, and reward merged into one flowing force that wore down opponents while preserving what future rule required. To their enemies, it appeared sudden. Persia vanished as an empire. Byzantium, though enduring, was diminished. However, this collapse was explained less by miracle than by strategy. Swift-moving troops outflanked heavier opponents. Knowledge of the desert turned hostile terrain into an advantage. Motivation drove fighters to endure what others would not. The outward-moving razzia tradition provided endless incentive, now channeled by a cause seen as both spiritual and pragmatic. Each of these elements, woven together, created an army capable of reshaping the map. However, military success always brings consequences beyond the battlefield. With every victory, the Muslim community faced new challenges. Territory expanded faster than the structures to control it. Armies once driven by a common purpose returned home enriched but restless. Behind these growing triumphs, internal questions that had been postponed since Muhammad's death began to surface. Who would now lead this vast and diverse community? Who held the right to command not only armies, but also the spiritual and political heart of the Ummah? When Muhammad died in 632, his followers faced a challenge for which no clear plan existed. Who should lead the community after him? The question went beyond mere administrative continuity. It concerned the very nature of authority. Was leadership meant to remain within his bloodline, beginning with his cousin and son-in-law Ali, or should it be chosen from trusted companions by the wider community? Many considered Ali the most natural heir. He was a family member, having been close to Muhammad for a long time, and was respected for his judgment. Yet others argued that inheritance through kin was not the principle by which Muhammad had lived. They believed authority should depend on consensus and devotion rather than family ties. In that context, Abu Bakr, a close companion from the earliest days, was chosen as the first caliph. His appointment set a precedent: succession through consultation among the community's leading members. But it was a fragile precedent, created amid uncertainty rather than universal agreement. The fragility was apparent almost immediately. Several tribes refused to accept Abu Bakr's authority, seeing the arrangement as imposed rather than freely chosen. These refusals led to the Ridda Wars, also known as the Wars of Apostasy, which were fought in 632 to 633. Abu Bakr suppressed the uprisings militarily and succeeded in re-establishing control. But the memory of that conflict remained vivid. It demonstrated how succession could lead to division rather than unity, and how military force might be necessary to maintain the empire's cohesion. The tension between chosen consensus and imposed authority existed from the very beginning. Subsequent caliphs managed to extend order by channeling the restless energy of tribes outward. Through conquest, rebellions at home were diverted into campaigns against Byzantium and Persia. This strategy proved effective in the short term, uniting factions through victory and the distribution of spoils. Yet each change of leadership reopened the fundamental question: who truly had the right to rule? That unresolved issue resurfaced with Caliph Uthman. Elected in 644, Uthman was a member of the powerful Umayyad clan. Over time, his reputation darkened with accusations of nepotism. Many accused him of appointing relatives to privileged positions and mismanaging the expanding empire. In 656, Uthman was assassinated by Muslim rebels, an unprecedented event. Until then, no caliph had died except in office or in battle. His violent death shattered the assumption that leadership was beyond internal challenge. Succession had now spilt into blood. After Uthman's assassination, Ali was proclaimed caliph. For those who had always seen him as Muhammad's rightful heir, this felt like a restoration. But Ali immediately faced fierce opposition, most notably from the Umayyad governor of Syria, Muawiyah. The dispute escalated into open conflict, remembered as the first fitna, literally, trial or upheaval. From 656 to 661, the Muslim community fought its own civil war. The battles were costly and inconclusive. In the end, tragedy repeated itself. In 661, Ali was assassinated. His death permanently deepened the split. Some followers rallied around his descendants, insisting that authentic leadership must always descend from Ali. They became known as the Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali, or Shia. For them, leadership was not simply a political matter, but a divine order. Each successor in Ali's line, called an imam, was believed to possess unique spiritual authority, serving as a guide for the entire community. In contrast, supporters of Muawiyah accepted a broader recognition of rule. They argued that the community as a whole could endorse capable rulers, regardless of family ties. What mattered was consensus and stability. Muawiyah's eventual victory led to the foundation of the Umayyad dynasty, with Damascus as its political center. These supporters became the majority of Sunnis. It is important to emphasize that this split did not initially emerge as a fully developed theological division. Initially, it was a political dispute over succession between family descent and community choice. However, as decades passed, each side embedded its stance into religious doctrine. For the Shia, imams were not merely leaders, they were divinely chosen figures. Over time, Shia identity came to emphasize justice, the memory of martyrdom, and hope for a messianic hidden imam who, although in occultation, would one day return to restore what was lost. These beliefs gave a persecuted minority community resilience and solidarity. For Sunnis, legitimacy depended on the community's acceptance. This pragmatism supported dynasties such as the Umayyads. Although Sunnis might criticize individual caliphs, the office was stabilized through consensus. Their vision created a system flexible enough to span an empire comprising many tribes and peoples. Stability and governance took precedence over lineage. Each community found significance in its position. The Shia carried powerful stories of sacrifice and resistance, uniting themselves through memories of injustice. Sunnis maintained continuity and order across vast distances. Together, these perspectives shaped enduring identities. What began with disputes over Muhammad's bloodline and the violent ends of Uthman and Ali evolved into lasting theological and social differences. A helpful way to envision this moment is as a fork in the road in the desert. Until 632, the community followed a single track led by Muhammad. With his death, the path forked. One route traced authority through family descent. The other is through consensus and pragmatic governance. Both routes moved forward, but never rejoined each other. Even after Ali's assassination, the empire did not fall apart. Muawiyah strengthened his control, and in establishing the Umayyad dynasty, moved the capital away from Medina. This change symbolized much more than just geography. It signified the shift from a community centered on a small Arabian town to a broader imperial state. The caliphate began to resemble a monarchy, governing through administration and hierarchy, rather than relying solely on kinship and early faith bonds. The consequences were profound. The memory of the First Civil War persisted, creating lasting divisions within belief and community. Sunni and Shia identities did not simply coexist. They defined each other through conflict. Leadership disputes that once shook Medina's small Umma now echoed across an empire that extended beyond Arabia. The process showed how succession could wound even as conquest widened. And a new issue arose. If the core of the community could no longer be rooted in Medina, what center could uphold this vast and growing imperial realm? That question was answered not in the desert, but in one of the great cities of the Mediterranean world. After the bloody conflict that shattered unity, power shifted decisively into the hands of the Umayyads. Muawiyah's victory not only established the first caliphate dynasty, but also made Syria its center. From there, Damascus became the capital. This was a significant change. The decision marks a pivotal moment when the caliphate transitioned from a small religious center to a full-fledged empire. With Damascus as its seat, the caliph's role became more imperial, bureaucratic, and monarchical than what Medina could sustain. Medina had always held symbolic importance. It was the city of the Prophet, the birthplace of the Umma, and the early core of the caliphate. However, its size and geography limited it. Its politics depended on tribal consensus and direct oaths in a space where ruler and citizen lived side by side. That model suited a young community, but not a territory covering Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Persia. Medina sat outside the main trade routes of the empire, too remote in the desert to serve as a governing hub. Damascus offered the opposite. Located in the Levant, it was near rich provinces, trade routes, and fertile land. Geography, administrative continuity, and the tax base all played a role here. The city was at a crossroads between east and west, controlled settled agriculture and steady income, and had bureaucrats trained by Byzantines who were already familiar with managing large territories. These reasons, location, revenue, and administrative structures, explain why Damascus was chosen. It was not only symbolically essential, but also practically vital for imperial rule. To the Umayyads, Damascus also symbolized inheritance. Here stood the remains of Byzantine administration, ready to be repurposed. Wide streets, aqueducts, markets, and scribes were already established. The new caliphs did not dismantle this infrastructure, they adapted it. Officials trained under the Byzantine Empire found roles within the new order. Records were preserved, taxes were collected in familiar ways, and the law was administered by scribes who understood the routine. By adopting these systems, the caliphate expanded rapidly without constructing new structures. An essential step that maintained order across vast areas that tribal custom alone could not manage. Symbolically, the change marked a clear transformation. In Medina, caliphs led humbly, dressed similarly to their followers, and gathered in courtyards for decision-making. In Damascus, the caliph sat in a palace, presiding over a court of scribes, guards, and ceremony. This was a monarchy in practice, if not in name. Authority became visual. The gap between ruler and subject widened. The leader of believers now resembled the great kings of neighboring civilizations, supported not just by personal reputation, but by the symbols of imperial power. Yet continuity persisted. Despite the caliph's more worldly appearance, the pillars of faith still bridged the distance. Daily prayer, fasting during Ramadan, almsgiving, and the annual pilgrimage united all believers in a shared rhythm of devotion. Whether in Damascus, Jerusalem, or Medina, they still faced the same direction. Ritual unity compensated for political separation. It ensured that, despite the grandeur of palaces, the spiritual order kept the caliph as a worshipper among worshippers. The contrast was evident, but the connection remained strong. For the believer, this unity was striking. In Medina, a caliph could be approached almost like an elder in the community. In Damascus, he was seen from afar, surrounded by gates and guards. Yet, in prayer, all phrases and movements were identical. The palace symbolized the political change. The mosque reinforced equality and devotion. This tension, imperial splendor combined with ritual humility, defined the Umayyad era. The move also served another purpose. Syria, and by extension Damascus, was wealthy. Unlike Arabia's deserts, its fields yielded crops, its merchants traded across seas, and its towns generated steady tax revenue. This meant armies could be supported not just by plunder, but by a reliable treasury. Spoils had initially driven conquest. Consolidation now required taxation. From Damascus, revenue flowed in from agricultural estates in Syria and Egypt, replacing the unstable income from raids and ensuring pay for soldiers and clerks. In this way, geography influenced economics, and economics in turn sustained the empire. The cultural importance was also significant. Damascus was no isolated tribal town. It was cosmopolitan and multi-religious. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side. Syriac, Greek, and Arabic were heard in its markets. This atmosphere reflected the caliphate itself, which now ruled millions of people across different faiths and languages. By basing itself in Damascus, the Umayyads made diversity appear normal rather than exceptional. A caliph presiding from here embodied universality, not just Arab tribal leadership. It is worth imagining the contrast. Medina was a humble courtyard where disputes could be settled face to face and decisions made through oaths. Damascus, on the other hand, was a city of stone and mosaic, layered with bureaucracy and history. The caliph in a palace was no longer expected to arbitrate in person, but to govern through laws, tax officials, and military commands. Intimacy was lost. Continuity was maintained through ritual. This created a new pattern: the caliph as both monarch and worshipper, palace figurehead, and man bowing in prayer. Why not keep the capital in Arabia, where Islam began? Because sacred history and political necessity diverged. Medina remained holy, and Mecca even more so, but neither could serve as the imperial core. Distance, limited resources, and a lack of bureaucratic tradition made them unsuitable for this purpose. Damascus was the place where armies could move swiftly to all fronts, where administrators spoke the languages of conquered lands, and where tax revenue could sustain the empire. In short, it was the logical solution to the problem of scale. The paradox continued. Caliphs lived like monarchs, but still anchored their authority in religion. Too much imperial distance sparked discontent. Too little structure threatened collapse. The Umayyads balanced this by incorporating Byzantine administrative practices while maintaining their Islamic roots. Rules could be documented in Greek or Syriac, yet all were expected to operate within a legal framework tied to the teachings that originated in Arabia. The empire's outward form was clear, but its spirit was rooted in scripture and prayer. This balance shaped the Umayyad Empire. Expansion needed good administration, stability relied on revenue, legitimacy depended on written laws, and ritual continuity. Damascus provided all three. From here, an empire could project authority across distances that Rome and Persia once controlled, yet set itself apart by maintaining unity not just through fear, but through simple, repeated acts of worship recognizable to every believer. As the palace in Damascus reshaped the image of the caliphate, a deeper question faced its subjects, one broader than buildings or capitals. The territory was vast, and the populations were diverse. Soldiers defended the borders, but what truly kept everything united each day? The answer was in something more lasting than any city, the framework of law and faith that organized life at every level of society. What unified millions of people who spoke different languages, had diverse customs, and now found themselves under the same empire? Military victories could conquer territory, and rulers could claim authority, but conquest alone did not guarantee loyalty. The answer was a legal and moral system, Sharia, that extended beyond the battlefield. Sharia provided rules and norms that introduced daily stability into a world that had been suddenly brought within vast new borders. Its roots lay in Muhammad's teachings and in the decisions of the earliest caliphs who succeeded him. What started as guidance, his rulings, sayings, and practices, was refined by successors into standards capable of bridging differences across regions. Tribes and local clans had always relied on customs to resolve disputes, but what worked in one valley did not suffice across an empire stretching from the Nile to Persia. Commerce, inheritance, landholding, and criminal justice all required consistency. Without it, conflicts could flare up again just as quickly as they had been suppressed. This is why qadis, or judges, became so important. They interpreted legal principles and applied them to cases in villages, towns, and courts across the empire. A qadi's role was not only to punish, but also to arbitrate, listen to disputes, and ensure fairness. A farmer in Egypt, challenging a boundary, or a merchant in Damascus disputing payment, faced the exact expectations. For ordinary people, this made law feel both accessible and obligatory. Even under foreign rulers, cases could be heard under a shared authority that claimed to be based on divine justice. Clerics and legal scholars reinforced that authority. They debated and studied the law, creating schools of thought and commentaries that spread across regions. Scholarship carried the same ideas from Arabia to Iraq, from Syria to North Africa, linking provinces that might otherwise have remained fragmented. Through them, principles could be adapted to new circumstances. Regions with different populations, including Jews and Christians, were not stripped of their identities. Instead, Sharia provided a framework that allowed their traditions to endure while still connecting them to the broader civil order. Hierarchical, yes, but stable. You might think of it as a skeleton beneath the empire. Armies acted as the muscles pushing it outward, but without a frame to keep it upright, those muscles would have collapsed under their own strain. Sharia provided shape and balance, restraining vengeance, securing obligations, and teaching that order was not merely established by decree, but through an enduring system. People grew to trust not in temporary conquests, but in routines that persisted year after year, enforced in the markets, the fields, and the households. That reliance on law brought about a subtle but vital shift. Force can command obedience temporarily, but lasting order emerges when people accept rules as fair and just. This was a lesson the early caliphs learned well. By appointing judges who claimed legitimacy through religion, rulers strengthened the belief that judgments represented not just politics, but justice itself. A ruling carried both the authority of the state and the mark of divine principle. That weight surpassed what tribal tradition or arbitrary commands could achieve on their own. The effect was evident in daily disputes. Consider the trader who signed a contract and wanted assurance that the transaction would be honored, or the farmer whose neighbor's cattle damaged his crops and who sought compensation without inciting a feud, or the widow who looked to her inheritance with hope of fairness. These were not abstract ideals, but lived realities. Rules linked such situations into predictable resolutions. For each person who appealed to justice, the sense of belonging to a larger order was renewed. Alongside formal courts, daily rituals reinforced that exact order. The 5 pillars did not replace law, but they worked alongside it. When people prayed, gave zakat, fasted during Ramadan, or undertook the pilgrimage, they synchronized their behavior across differences. Prayer brought local communities together, creating shared assemblies. Zakat redistributed wealth, binding the rich to the poor through obligation rather than chance. Fasting fostered solidarity and discipline, drawing the rich and poor into identical experiences. These acts shaped social rhythm, giving law its own distinct rhythm. Each practice became a marker not just of faith, but also of commitment to an organized society. This blending of practice and principle set Islam apart sharply from neighboring regions. In post-Roman Western Europe, legal systems fragmented. Each community followed its own code, enforced by local rulers. Disagreements often descended into private revenge, and contracts were risky due to the lack of an empire-wide authority to enforce them. The Islamic world, by contrast, had begun to unite different regions under a more consistent set of expectations. While Europe's patchwork created instability, The caliphate's legal coherence fostered stability, consistency fostered trust, and trust promoted prosperity. Farmers increased investment in their land when they believed their property rights were secure. Merchants undertook long journeys, confident that courts could uphold contracts even far from home. Families, in cases of inheritance or disputes, could look to principles greater than kinship authority. No law was perfect, and inequality persisted, but the difference from the past was clear. Stability was valued more than perfection, and stability secured loyalty. The reinforcement through ritual made this order more than just external. It became a part of the individual's identity. People did not merely obey, they performed it. Every prayer time signified belonging. Each fast reminded communities of shared restraint. Every act of obligation reflected fairness, rooted not only in governance, but also in devotion. In this way, religion and law were woven together. Remove either thread, and the fabric weakens. Together, they became habits of life. From a distance, this framework made the caliphate appear more permanent than the victories that had given rise to it. An army might win ground in a year, but a contract upheld in court, a land boundary confirmed, a widow's inheritance protected. These were the measures by which an empire remained real to its subjects. They were how conquest translated into governance. They were how diversity became cohesion. In practice, the Islamic world succeeded by addressing two universal needs, justice and belonging, and connecting them through a shared language of law and ritual. The exact words of prayer repeated each day reinforced trust that contracts, taxes, and disputes would develop within a consistent order. Predictability became its own form of cohesion, binding communities together. Stability arose not by chance, but through repetition, fairness, and visible links between principle and daily life. Therefore, when examining how the empire endured, the answer is not solely in armies or dynasties, but in this civil order. Law, supported by ritual, provided coherence for a society broader than any tribe had imagined. It guaranteed that the empire's foundation was not merely the memory of conquest, but the lived reality of justice and devotion. And it is here that you can most clearly see how rituals were never just personal. They served as the architecture of the empire itself. From the unification of tribes to the rise of empires, the story of early Islam illustrates how belief and practice established a lasting order. The 5 pillars, confession, prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage, were simple in structure, but carried great significance in uniting diverse peoples into a single community. They provided patterns of rhythm and duty that, in many cases, rivaled traditional bonds such as kinship and wealth. What began with an Arabian merchant transformed much of the known world, where faith offered not only meaning, but governance.